I'm the material promotional person. That's one of my jobs on this part of this project. And I have bumper stickers. U.S. militarism fuels climate crisis. And if you're wondering what I can do, you can put a bumper sticker on your car or somewhere. So I'm selling them at a cost, 50 bumper stickers for $30. And you can hand them out or take donations for them or whatever. And you can get them. You can either go to our national website, veteransforpeace.org/take-action/climate crisis, or you can get them from me directly, bwrvfp27@gmail.com. So that's I just want to get that out of the way. So anyhow, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Gary, and I can attest, like I said, he's just such a great, passionate man. The work he does is just unbelievable. And he's going to tell you about the work that we're doing to help solve the climate crisis. People don't talk about the military's contribution, but it's huge. So I'm just going to say Gary was drafted into the U.S. Army during the Vietnam War and then declared as a conscientious objector and opposed the war while still in the military. He is resolute in acting on his commitment to peace. He is a past president of the San Diego chapter of Veterans for Peace and is currently on the steering committee of the National Veterans for Peace Climate and Crisis Militarism Project. He's also a member of San Diego 350.org and is keenly interested in the effects of militarism on the climate crisis. Gary cares a lot about this world of ours and trying to save us from the climate crisis. So take it away, Gary. Oh, by the way, one more thing. We will have time for question and answer. I had thought that it was after each speaker, but it said in the program at the end. I'm not totally sure how that's going to work, but we are, so please submit your questions. I know Amy Blumenthal already sent one. So just put them in the chat, and we'll have some time after people speak. Okay.
I am Gary Butterfield. Can you hear me okay? I'm honored to be here as a representative of the climate crisis and militarism project of Veterans for Peace. And after listening to the first part of this program, I'd have to say that Anissa, Megan, and Jamil, you would certainly be welcome into our group. You do not have to be a veteran, but you have stated a lot of what we feel and what we believe. And what I intend to do is part of my portion of this program is to look at how militarism impacts the climate crisis. I am also a member of San Diego 350, and it's surprising to me that when I discuss issues of militarism, most of the members of the 350.org group are quiet. They're underinformed. So I looked at the situation. I see these as two existential threats, similar as to what our executive director, Garrett Repenhagen, believes, as you can see on the screen here. But I've got a 5-year-old grandson, and I know that we've got to do better than what we're doing to leave a world to those who come after us. And I see the U.S. military as being one of the greatest contributors to climate destruction in the world. Now, we know that climate change is widespread, rapid, and intensifying. And according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report for the UN, the Secretary General called this situation a code red for humanity. We know that we're in dire straits. The current global temperature rise is approaching 1.2, 1.3 degrees. We see increasing hurricanes, intensified fires, floods, heat domes. We have members in Portland who lived through the most recent heat domes and with major loss of life up there. And of course, we see Arctic ice loss and sea level rise. The picture on the left illustrates one of the most vulnerable situations caused by the drought, the ongoing famine in Madagascar, combined with a cyclone, both of which were created by climate change created an estimated 600,000 people who are in need of emergency feeding, according to the World Food Program. And of course, we see global warming and the temperatures continue to rise. So our group, the Climate Crisis and Militarism Project, was formed over a year ago out of the last Veterans for Peace National Convention that was held online. We like to think that we're looking at four major areas of focus. One, the tremendous carbon footprint of the US military, which is larger than that of many countries. We want to look at the wars for oil, other extractive resources, and for profit, and how they continue to support fossil fuel-based status quo and enrich military contractors. We want to examine how both of these existential crises place an overwhelming burden on people of color, the poor, and future generations. And then we want to look at the tremendous amount of money, our tax dollars that go to this war machine, and look at possibly doing something to redirect that money to respond to the existential threat of climate crisis. So we put this presentation together primarily to remind our Veterans for Peace members of the interrelationship between these two threats, with an eye towards getting out of our silo and educating our climate activist friends to the true threat and examine how militarism impacts the climate crisis. And of course, we know from our experiences, there is no such thing as a green war. The effects of war and preparation for war are polluting and long lasting. For example, the use of depleted uranium, which is used in tank armor and some bullets, is 40% depleted of its radioactivity, but it retains all the toxicity of natural uranium. Even today, more than 50 years after the Vietnam War, children are still maimed by unexploded ordnance or born with severe birth defects from the transgenerational impact of Agent Orange. And something that was in the news, a major announcement by the EPA just yesterday, talking about how they want to regulate PFAS, which are man-made chemicals, which are known as forever chemicals. They're used in Teflon and many other commercial products, including dental floss and makeup, but they can cause reproductive damage. Where we see it the most is that it's a major component of firefighting foam used on military bases. What you're seeing on this current slide is an example of a burn pit, which is an open air site of solid waste incineration, which has been the subject of many lawsuits by veterans and civilians alike. And of course, we can't overlook the entire production from mining and processing of uranium to go into nuclear weapons. This is without even having to explode them, which of course we hope never happens. Any war is climate destruction. Preparation for war is the same. I want to take a second and talk about this term of greenwashing by the military. We hear from time to time some of military spokespeople talking about the efforts that they are taking, such as placing solar panels on infantrymen's backpacks and experimental biodiesel for naval vessels. Well, wars and preparation for wars go far beyond these two efforts at reducing the Pentagon's carbon footprint. So let's look at that footprint. The carbon footprint of the US military is larger than that of many countries. And one of the things our group is doing is that we have written a House resolution to demand that the Pentagon set clear greenhouse gas emission reduction targets that are consistent with the 2015 Paris Agreement. The Pentagon must commit to accounting for all of these emissions in a way that's robust and verifiable for all domestic and overseas U.S. military operations. When the time comes, we're going to have a campaign to ask you to help us gain congressional support for this resolution, which will be sponsored by Representative Barbara Lee of California. This resolution will encompass all U.S. military emissions with an eye towards reduction of that carbon footprint and the eventual reduction in the military size. So now, let's take a look at the elephant in the room. And I live in San Diego, and it's estimated that we have over 100,000 active duty troops, and we're the third largest site of retirees, of military retirees in the country. So we're truly in the belly of the beast here. But when climate plans, climate action plans are formulated by the state, the county, the city, even by neighborhoods, nobody talks about how the military impacts climate change. They talk about how the military might be impacted by climate change with rising sea levels. What are they going to do with their bases? With increased hurricanes, what are they going to do with the added destruction that's there? But we know that the military's contribution is something that's shrouded in secrecy by the US government for years. This dates back to the 1997 Kyoto Protocol on climate change, where the US pressured all the other countries in the world to keep the reporting of military emissions out of any country's total contribution to their climate damage. We do see that changing to a degree. The most recent NATO Secretary John Stoltenberg said in public remarks when he greeted the US climate envoy John Kerry that climate change makes the world more unsafe. So NATO needs to step up and play a bigger role in combating it, including reducing military emissions. This is recognition internationally that militaries throughout the globe, and particularly the US, have a bigger role in the destruction of the climate than is typically acknowledged. For example, if the US military was a country, it would rank as number 47 among all the countries in the world in greenhouse gas emissions. This is just from calculating emissions from fuel usage. Think about that. A single organization polluting more carbon dioxide than many entire mid-sized nations. And again, these are only from estimated figures because the military does not provide complete values for their emissions. Did you know that the US military is the world's largest institutional consumer of petroleum products and also the most prolific single institutional emitter of greenhouse gases in the world? And this is from Laura Steichen and Lindsay Kashgarian of the National Priorities Project, No Warming, No War. Most of the resources that we cite in this presentation can be found on our website, which would be seen in the chat as we move through this presentation. But as an example, the B-52, which is almost as old as I am, consumes about as much fuel in an hour as an average car driver uses in 7 years. That's one jet. And then what about the Blue Angels or the Air Force Thunderbirds? that seem to be omnipresent at sporting events as a sign of patriotism. Well, each time they fly overhead for our entertainment, they use approximately 18,000 gallons of jet fuel per hour. Well, what does that mean? Well, it doesn't mean much to me, but what it means to an average car being driven over 290,000 miles would produce the same amount of carbon dioxide. And on a more human level, 10% of these stunt pilots for the Blue Angels and Thunderbirds have died in aircraft crashes since their inception in 1953. Of course, military jets are the largest consumer of fossil fuels in the military, but they're not the only contributors. As Anissa stated, the U.S. supports over 750 to 800 bases internationally and maintains a fleet of vehicles that totals nearly 190,000 vehicles. This includes over 75,000 Humvees, which typically get 4 to 6 miles per gallon. In fact, except for the 80 nuclear submarines and aircraft carriers, the entire military fleet of all vehicles runs on oil. And this is from Barry Sanders writing in the Green Zone, which is a quick read and highly informative. You can also find that on our website. But the US is going beyond the Earth with the establishment of the United States Space Force, which is going to carry a heavy carbon load for its many computers, rockets, and multiple satellites that they plan on launching to achieve their mission. Our second focus is to look at what motivates us to get involved in wars. Typically, it's for oil, other extractive resources, and of course, it's for profit. And these help support the fossil fuel-based status quo and enrich military contractors and weapons manufacturers. Now, Veterans for Peace, we don't have an issue with America's troops. We have issues with the policies that direct their activities. In addition to maintaining and supplying those 800 overseas bases, the U.S. routinely conducts major training exercises involving massive numbers of troops and equipment with its allies. And of course, we know in the Persian Gulf, major commercial oil companies enjoy the protection of the U.S. military. This is at no cost to them, but at a high cost to U.S. taxpayers. Anissa also mentioned money that was spent on the global war on terror. Well, half of it, nearly half of it, has gone to the big five contractors: Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon, General Dynamics, and Northrop Grumman. And part of that issue also encompasses the revolving door of high-ranking retired military leaving the military and then going to the board of directors on these military contractors and then making agreements to purchase military equipment. In fact, of the 8 generals who were in charge of the Afghanistan and Iraq wars over the last 20 years have been on 20 different boards of these military contractors. But let's not overlook the residual pollution that any war in preparation for war leaves. Within the United States, there are over 900 current or former US military installations that are classified as EPA Superfund sites. Superfund sites, of course, are polluted locations in the US that require long-term cleanup. And of course, the aftermath of Warfare's shelling, bombing, and destruction also requires intensive rebuilding, all at a huge cost in greenhouse gas emissions. Now, General Smedley Butler is someone who's familiar to most Veterans for Peace members. He wrote a very brief book called War is a Racket. It's still relevant reading. When General Butler died in 1940, he was the US Marine Corps' most decorated soldier. He fought in the Philippine-American War, the Boxer Rebellion, the Mexican Revolution, and World War I. He saw action in the Philippines, China, Central America, the Caribbean, and France. But after his career was ended, he became an outspoken critic of America's corporate and imperialistic wars. His book is still relevant today. We see who the winners are in these so-called wars. From the 2003 invasion of Iraq through 2020, over 1 million US servicemen and women had been deployed in Iraq, with the peak occurring in 2007. And although boots on the ground is the most commonly cited measure of troop strength, that measure did not include over 100,000 other troops deployed in the region, providing theater-wide support for the various operations: Enduring Freedom, Iraqi Freedom, Afghanistan. And these numbers don't even include private contractors. And one general, was the former head of the US Central Command, was quoted as saying, "Of course it's about oil. We can't really deny that." So we have almost a self-serving circle here of militarism supporting wars for oil and oil for wars. And you would think that with the Afghanistan war finally winding down, we would see some type of peace. But we're hearing increased noise directed at China and Russia. On the left, we see US and British warships involved with also the Australian Navy in war games near the Philippines. There are regular exercises with South Korea and Japan. And NATO in Europe has virtually surrounded Russia with a ring of ballistic missiles, in spite of prior promises to refrain from such provocative actions. All of these at a tremendous cost to the environment. This map shows many of the nearly 800 bases throughout the world. You can see that they're clustered in the Persian Gulf, in Europe, Africa, and in Asia. The bases range in size from the smallest lily pads, they call them, that typically provide prepositioned weaponry and supplies, to huge complexes including housing, hospitals, bowling alleys, golf courses, and their own power plants. And this is from David Vine's informative book, Base Nation. Think of those supply lines. Think of the fuel that's spent in that. But with both of these existential threats, the burden is increasingly borne by people of color, the poor, and future generations. Prolonged droughts, torrential rainfall, and persistent wildfires are emblematic of climate change. All of these will force population displacement throughout the world, creating climate refugees. We've already heard about the reinforcement of the US border along the Mexican southern border with the US, and that is serving to inhibit refugees from streaming north from Central and South America. Causes of that migration are complex, but climate damage to crops and water supplies are increasing factors. And the US government, though, is dead serious about climate change, no matter what you hear, but not in the way you might think. Planners at the Pentagon have been quietly preparing to take charge of a planet shaken by climate chaos. Investigative journalist Christian Perenni refers to plans like these as the politics of the armed lifeboat, wherein we surround ourselves with a barrier, whether it be a physical barrier or militarized borders. We've already seen the devastating effects of drought as one source of the prolonged Syrian civil war and the resultant refugee tide that's engulfing Europe. Crop failures due to drought in Central and South America pressure refugees to move north to the United States. And in fact, with the wildfires in California, I understand that there are even climate refugees escaping California to go north to Oregon within our own country. Another way of looking at the long-term damage of greenhouse gas emissions, the social cost of carbon, this actually brings it down to a human level. And military emissions on a daily basis, even without an active war going on, have tremendous impact upon societies, including the US. What we'll see within our country, and I think we're already starting to see this, are household budget impacts, including costs of food, energy, gas, electricity, property damage from climate-caused storms, means dislocation, increased insurance costs, rising rents, housing scarcity, disrupted supply lines lead to higher consumer prices. For us in the US, we see these as inconveniences. For others, it is a difference between life and death. And what of all that money that is spent on the US military? Well, the National Priorities Project estimated in a report called State of Insecurity, the cost of militarization since 9/11, that the global war on terror has cost this country over $21 trillion over the last 2 decades. And you can see from the chart that annual military spending by the US is more than the next 10 countries combined. Of that $21 trillion, the US has spent on foreign and domestic militarization since 9/11. 16 trillion went to the military, including 7 trillion for military contractors, 3 trillion to veterans programs, nearly $1 trillion to homeland security, and almost 750 billion to federal law enforcement, which is increasingly militarized. Now, I know that you all have ideas on what we might do with that money. The National Priorities Project estimated that $4.5 trillion could fully decarbonize the US electric grid. A mere $1.7 trillion could erase student debt. So you get the idea. $25 billion could provide COVID vaccines for the population of low-income countries. There are much better uses of that money. Now, I know this is a busy chart, but focus on the dark blue or the blue here, this half, this semicircle. That's what Biden is proposing for fiscal year 2022. This puts the military as a line item at nearly 50% of our discretionary budget. But that military is misleading, that $765 billion. That's actually more than the military requested. It's more than Biden requested, as Congress added an extra $24 billion in the last 2 months. But many items that you would think should be included in the military budget are omitted. Key items like nuclear weapons, well, that's a line item in the energy column. And don't forget veterans benefits. That's another $114 billion. There are many other items: Homeland Security, border enforcement, intelligence agencies, and of course, the interest payment on this debt, because the country has put it on a credit card for the last 20 years. If you put it all together, it comes to over $1.25 trillion. Now, I know that that's a lot of money. Sometimes it's seen as a jobs program because there's something in every congressional district that supports military spending. But the sad fact is, for all that money, the Pentagon really can't account for it accurately. It's failed all of its 3 audits over the past couple years. They spend a lot and they don't even know how they spend it. So I know I've presented a lot of facts, a lot of alarming issues that are brought up, but we've got to get people talking about both of these issues in the same conversation. So what has our group done? Well, we have been successful in setting up a very robust website. You can see it on the screen here. And we recommend that you go to that website and look at those resources and use them. We've set up, part of that website is keeping up with Climate Envoy John Kerry. In fact, we've met with Kerry's staff, which was a very, I guess you'd call it a friendly meeting, but there's been no follow-up on his part. We've also been successful in meeting with Representative Barbara Lee's staff to gain her consent to introduce that House resolution to accurately measure and report all U.S. military emissions. And of course, this slideshow, we've presented this to nearly 30 groups now, and it seems to be growing. We want to get the word out, particularly to climate activist groups, about the relationship that these 2 existential threats have with each other. What can you do? Well, incorporate the 2 issues when you talk about peace, when you talk about the climate crisis. We've got to talk about militarism. Use our tools, and, don't let politicians off the hook. Both major political parties, Democrats and Republicans, routinely approve increases in the military budget. And that's got to stop. We are seeing some activity in Congress to curtail this, but it's got to be much more robust than that. We're thinking that starting with the resolution on military emissions, that'll be a good entree into getting this conversation more mainstream. So I thank you for listening to us. I thank you for inviting us to your program. We are stronger together. We have to talk about this. I look forward to our discussion at the end of our presentations.
Yeah, I have a question probably directed to Gary. Somebody commented on the bumper sticker that they think it should, instead of saying US, it ought to just say militarism fuels climate crisis. So, can you kind of explain a little bit about why we chose US versus just militarism in general?
Sure, because we're in the US and we can probably more directly communicate with climate activists in the US about what's happening in the US. Certainly, Russia has a lot of tanks and they emit a lot of greenhouse gases, but that's very, very removed from what our activity is. And so that's the response.
Okay, thanks, Gary.